They started as a support club, nobody's main event, nobody's priority, just a crew of bikers in red and white, doing the dirty work that the Hells Angels didn't want attached to their name. In just over 2 decades, that changed completely. The world they were born into. To understand the Red Devils, you have to understand the world that made them necessary. By the mid-1990s, the outlaw motorcycle club landscape across the Western world had already hardened into something resembling a military map. Territories were drawn, alliances were sealed, rivalries were lethal. At the top of that map sat the Hells Angels, founded in Fontana, California in 1948, expanded aggressively across North America through the 1960s and 70s, and by the 1990s, operating in over 24 countries with tens of thousands of members and prospects across every inhabited continent. They were not simply a motorcycle club anymore. They were an international criminal franchise worth billions of dollars annually in drug trafficking, extortion, weapons smuggling, and money laundering. And investigators knew it. But knowing it and proving it in a courtroom are 2 entirely different problems. The Hells Angels had survived decades of law enforcement attention by doing something that most criminal organizations never master. They understood the value of distance, not physical distance, organizational distance, the space between the people who give orders and the people who carry them out. The further that distance, the harder it is for a prosecutor to build a case that reaches the top of the structure. And the Angels had spent 30 years engineering exactly that kind of distance into the way they operated. A franchise needs infrastructure. It needs people willing to absorb the most dangerous work, the street-level enforcement, the distribution networks, the territorial confrontations that generate bodies and police reports. That kind of work creates exposure, and the Hells Angels, at the level they were operating by the late 1990s, could not afford unlimited exposure. Every member who got arrested carrying product, carrying weapons, or carrying out violence was a thread that investigators could potentially pull. Pull enough threads, and the whole structure unravels. Support clubs had existed inside the biker world for decades. The idea was simple: create affiliated organizations that operate close to the Angels' interests without formally belonging to the parent structure. If a support club member gets arrested, the charges stop there. If a support club chapter gets raided, the Angels maintain plausible distance. The support club absorbs the heat. The parent club retains the profit. It was a system designed by people who understood leverage, and it had worked well enough for long enough that nobody questioned whether it needed to be redesigned. Until it stopped working. By the late 1990s, that system had a serious problem. The support clubs in operation across Europe and North America were either too localized to provide genuine operational value across multiple markets, too internally unstable to be trusted with sensitive work, or so compromised by their own criminal exposure that they were creating liability rather than absorbing it. The Angels needed something different, something more structured, more scalable, more controllable across international borders without the friction that came with managing dozens of independent, unpredictable organizations. They needed a club that could function like a corporation: standardized processes, reliable leadership, predictable outcomes, and the discipline to stay quiet under pressure. In Karlstad, Sweden, in 2001, they built one. The modern Red Devils Motorcycle Club, known formally as the RDMC, was founded in Sweden, not as a local crew looking for recognition, not as a group of friends who shared a passion for riding, but as a purpose-built entity with a clearly defined operational role inside the Hells Angels global support network. From day one, membership was selective, leadership was disciplined, communication protocols were strict, and the operational philosophy was built around one principle that most street-level organizations never fully internalize: discretion is worth more than reputation. Do the work, stay quiet, stay useful. Within 12 months of their founding, the Red Devils had already crossed the Atlantic. A chapter was established in Massachusetts in 2002. Belgium followed in 2003. The Netherlands, Germany, Australia, Brazil, Turkey, Singapore, and the United Kingdom all followed in rapid succession. The expansion didn't slow down. It accelerated with each new chapter, as the network effect of belonging to a global organization made each new chapter easier to establish than the last. And with every new chapter planted, the Red Devils embedded deeper into the global architecture of outlaw biker power. Law enforcement agencies on 3 continents would spend years trying to figure out what they were actually looking at. A motorcycle club, a criminal organization, a front for the Angels, a genuinely independent club that happened to align with Angel interests. The answer, as investigators would eventually conclude after years of surveillance, financial forensics, and cross-border intelligence sharing, was simpler and more troubling than any of those categories alone. The Red Devils were all of it, simultaneously, and they had been built that way on purpose. What came before the original Red Devils? The name Red Devils did not originate in Sweden in 2001. That matters, because buried inside this story is a completely different organization, older, quieter, and almost entirely forgotten outside of a narrow corridor in southern Ontario, Canada. Understanding that original club and what ultimately happened to it is what makes the modern RDMC's rise even more remarkable. 2 organizations, same name, completely different trajectories, completely different fates, and only one of them survived long enough to matter on the global stage. The original Red Devils Motorcycle Club was founded in Hamilton, Ontario in 1948. That places them in the earliest wave of post-war outlaw biker culture, the same period that produced the Hells Angels in California, the Pagans on the East Coast, and dozens of other clubs that grew directly from the restlessness of men returning from combat. These were soldiers who had seen things that civilian life had no framework for. Men who had operated under extreme pressure, in close proximity to violence and death, with a brotherhood built on absolute mutual dependence. And then the war ended, and the government handed them discharge papers and told them to go home and be normal. Most couldn't. Motorcycles gave them speed. Clubs gave them the brotherhood they'd lost. And in a society that wanted them to quietly resume civilian life and never talk about what they'd done or seen, the open road gave them the only thing that felt honest: forward motion with no destination and no explanation required. The Hamilton crew called themselves the Red Devils. When other unrelated groups across North America began using the same name, it was a common enough choice. Dramatic without being criminal, the Canadians added original in front of it. That one word said everything about how they saw themselves: foundational, legitimate, unwilling to be confused with anyone else. They had been there first, and they intended everyone to know it. For more than 6 decades, the original Red Devils operated out of 3 chapters: Hamilton, Chatham-Kent, and Sudbury. They were deliberately small, deliberately local. According to veteran Canadian journalists who covered the biker world through its most violent decades, that restraint was not weakness. It was survival strategy, refined over 60 years of operating in a world where the wrong kind of attention could destroy a club overnight. They were careful about who they let in. They avoided recruiting members who attracted unnecessary police attention, men with recent charges, men with profiles, men whose presence would invite surveillance onto the entire club. They avoided what biker culture calls heat scores. They maintained respectful working relationships with larger clubs, including the Hells Angels, without ever formally subordinating themselves or surrendering their independence. That independence was everything. It was the thing they had protected for 60 years. And for most of those 60 years, that balance had kept them functional in a world that swallowed more aggressive organizations whole. But staying small also meant staying vulnerable in ways that didn't become obvious until the moment they became unavoidable. The 9th of May, 1984, Hamilton, Ontario. Multiple shots ripped through the walls of the original Red Devils clubhouse during a coordinated drive-by attack. 32-year-old full-patch member Michael Carey was killed. The shooting exposed something the club had always known but rarely had to confront so directly. Even the most careful organizations bleed when enemies decide they are worth hitting. Restraint does not make you invisible. It only delays the moment when someone tests whether you'll fight back. The aftermath revealed exactly who the original Red Devils were. They didn't retaliate publicly. They didn't escalate. They rebuilt their clubhouse, this time with cinder block walls and steel rebar reinforcement, turning what had been a meeting place into something closer to a fortified structure. The message they sent was not aggression, it was endurance. We are still here. We are not moving. We will absorb this and continue. That response, measured and deliberate, told everyone watching, that this was a club that prioritized survival over spectacle. By 2000, Hamilton police had grown frustrated enough with the club's continued operation to launch a large-scale raid on the compound. Battering ram through the front gate, concussion grenades thrown inside to disorient anyone present, a full tactical response designed to look like the culmination of a major criminal investigation. Investigators went in expecting to find evidence of a significant criminal enterprise. What they actually found was unlicensed alcohol, a modest quantity of ammunition, and small amounts of narcotics. Not nothing, but nothing close to what the scale of the operation implied they were hunting. The raid made headlines. The results made the police look like they had used a sledgehammer to crack an egg. The original Red Devils had outlasted bigger clubs, survived targeted violence, withstood years of police pressure, and kept operating on their own terms for more than 6 decades. Their longevity was a genuine achievement in a world where most clubs don't survive a single bad decade. But by 2014, the equation had shifted in ways their model simply could not accommodate. The membership was aging. Key figures who had held the club together through its most difficult periods were stepping back or stepping out. The biker world itself was transforming at a pace their philosophy of restraint and independence couldn't match. Larger international clubs, including the organization that had taken their name and run with it across 5 continents, were expanding aggressively into Canadian territory. And a club with 3 chapters, an aging membership, and a 60-year philosophy of staying small had very limited options when that kind of organized, resourced, international force moved into their neighborhood. The original Red Devils made a decision: not to fight a battle they couldn't win, not to patch over to an organization they hadn't chosen. Instead, they formally dissolved, ending the club on their own terms, preserving what they could of the brotherhood they had spent 6 decades building. Members patched over to the East Coast-based Backers Motorcycle Club, a longtime ally. They adopted a specialized brotherhood patch to keep alive the bond between men who had shared something that most people on the outside would never understand. 66 years, 3 chapters, 1 name, gone. And on the other side of the world, the organization that had taken that same name was entering its most aggressive expansion phase yet. Red and white, what the colors mean. Inside outlaw motorcycle culture, colors are not decoration, they are information. Every patch stitched onto a biker's cut carries specific meaning: rank, territory, achievement, loyalty, and in some cases, documented acts that cannot be described in polite company. The vest itself, known in biker culture as a cut, functions like a military uniform crossed with a service record. To outsiders, it looks like a leather jacket covered in symbols and sewn-on badges. Inside the 1%er world, it is a document, a resume, a record of where someone has been, what they have done, and exactly where they stand in a hierarchy that most civilians will never see clearly enough to understand. The Hells Angels claimed ownership over a specific color combination decades ago: red and white. In the outlaw biker world, that combination is their trademark, their protected property, their signal to every person in the room who knows the language. Wearing red and white without explicit permission from the Angels is not a fashion choice, it is a declaration." End quote. And the response to that kind of unauthorized declaration has historically been swift, physical, and final. That is what makes the Red Devils' colors so operationally significant. As one of the Hells Angels' most trusted and operationally critical support clubs, the Red Devils are granted the rare privilege of wearing red and white. Not every support club gets this. Many operate in different colors precisely to maintain the visual separation that gives the Angels their legal insulation. But the Red Devils wear red and white, openly, in every country where they operate. That visible alignment instantly signals status, trust, and direct connection to one of the most powerful criminal organizations on Earth. It is not symbolic, it is functional. It tells every rival organization, every law enforcement officer doing surveillance, and every prospect hoping to earn a patch exactly where the Red Devils stand in the hierarchy. Not close to power, inside it. The patches themselves operate through a strict earning system. One phrase, repeated across the biker world in various forms and in various languages, captures the philosophy completely. You earn patches. You do not buy them, you do not inherit them, and you do not receive them as a courtesy. Wearing a patch without completing the process that earns, it is considered one of the highest possible forms of disrespect inside these organizations, an act that has historically resulted in immediate physical consequences, up to and including death. Full patch members have been documented physically stripping cuts off people found wearing unauthorized patches in public. The process of earning a patch is not a formality, it is the entire point. The path toward full membership in the Red Devils follows a structure that will be familiar to anyone who has studied how the most durable criminal organizations in the world manage loyalty. It begins with prospecting an initiation phase that former members and law enforcement sources who have spent years studying these clubs describe as intentionally brutal, both physically and psychologically. Prospects clean clubhouses. They handle maintenance, run errands at any hour, guard bikes, manage logistics during runs and events, and remain permanently available to full patch members regardless of what else is happening in their personal lives. That availability is not optional. It is the first test, and it runs continuously for the entirety of the prospect period, which can last anywhere from several months to several years, depending on how the club evaluates the individual. But the visible work is only the surface layer. Beneath it is something considerably harder. Prospects are subjected to constant psychological pressure, specifically designed to break down ego, personal independence, and the ordinary civilian instinct to prioritize the self. Full patch members create unpredictable, high-pressure situations to measure how a prospect reacts under stress and under humiliation. One documented test known inside biker culture as a bang check involves a patched member delivering a sudden, hard open palm strike to the prospect's forehead without warning and watching carefully whether the prospect reacts with uncontrolled anger or maintains discipline under the provocation. An uncontrolled reaction means the prospect has failed. Controlled silence means the prospect may have potential. The test seems simple from the outside. Inside the culture, it is reading something specific, whether this person can be trusted to absorb pressure without becoming a liability. Anger means failure. Control means potential. The whole system is designed to produce one specific outcome: a member who has been stripped, over time and under real pressure, of the instinct to prioritize himself over the club. By the time someone earns a full patch inside the Red Devils, they have already demonstrated under real pressure, repeatedly, over an extended period, that their loyalty is not a preference or a calculation. It is a condition. It is simply how they operate. That level of demonstrated, verified loyalty is precisely what makes the Red Devils so valuable to the Hells Angels, and it is exactly what makes them so dangerous to everyone who operates outside that structure. Shock troops, the operational role. Investigators who have spent careers studying outlaw motorcycle clubs use one phrase repeatedly when describing the modern Red Devils' function inside the Hells Angels network: shock troops. The term comes from military doctrine that predates the First World War. Shock troops are specialized units deployed at the point of maximum violence, in the front edge of a conflict where the risk is highest, the exposure is most direct, and the casualties are most predictable. They absorb the initial damage so that the main force can advance into secured territory. The main force gets the land. The shock troops take the losses. In military terms, it is a strategy built on the calculated expendability of the unit deployed at the front. Inside the Hells Angels' operational structure, the Red Devils function with almost identical logic. Drug routes that carry too much investigative risk for direct Angels involvement are managed through Red Devils chapters. Territorial confrontations with rival organizations, the Bandidos, the Pagans, the Outlaws, regional clubs pushing against Angels-aligned turf in new markets are handled at the front line by Red Devils members who take the direct exposure, while Angels leadership maintains operational distance. Weapons transportation across borders, high-risk logistics, physical enforcement of financial agreements, and territorial boundaries. All of it flows through support clubs like the Red Devils, keeping the parent organization insulated from the direct exposure that generates federal investigations, RICO prosecutions, and the kind of media attention that complicates business. It is, in the language of organized crime, a genuinely brilliant system. The Red Devils absorb the immediate police pressure. The Angels retain plausible distance. If a Red Devils chapter gets raided and its members are charged, the criminal exposure stops at the chapter level. The support club structure creates a legal buffer that has frustrated prosecutors across multiple jurisdictions for more than 2 decades, forcing investigators to spend years building evidence chains that bridge the gap between the people carrying out the work and the people directing it. But the relationship between the Red Devils and the Angels runs considerably deeper than simple operational utility. The Red Devils also function as one of the Angels' most important vetting systems, a proving ground where individuals are evaluated over years before being considered for full membership in the parent organization. Men who demonstrate exceptional discipline, operational reliability, loyalty under pressure, and the specific kind of judgment that distinguishes a genuinely valuable member from a liability are identified and tracked. Over time, the most impressive performers are considered for a patch over the process by which a Red Devils member transitions to full Hells Angels membership. By the time someone completes that transition, their commitment has already been verified through real-world service at the most dangerous operational level. The Angels are not taking a chance on someone unknown. They are promoting someone whose reliability has already been demonstrated, in the field, under real conditions. The United Kingdom expansion made this dynamic visible in a way that investigators found unusually transparent. In 2011, the Red Devils established a Middlesex chapter in the UK under the umbrella of the Hells Angels Windsor Charter. The chapter launched with only 10 members, but these were not 10 random recruits drawn from the general population of motorcycle enthusiasts. They were 10 highly experienced, carefully selected individuals placed deliberately in a specific geographic location to build a specific kind of operational presence. Within a short period, that 10-person foothold had expanded into a significant Red Devils network across Britain, with multiple chapters and a membership count that would have seemed impossible to predict from the modest size of the original group. 10 members, multiple chapters across the country, years, not decades. That is not organic growth, that is architecture. The speed and precision of Red Devils' expansion across Europe, North America, Asia-Pacific, and South America tells a story about how the club was fundamentally designed. This was not a group of bikers who happened to get popular and found themselves managing an unexpectedly large organization. This was an organization built from day one to expand, equipped with the resources to do it efficiently, and positioned inside a global hierarchy that gave it both the protection and the operational infrastructure to plant chapters in new markets before rivals could understand what was happening and respond. Everything about it was deliberate. The selection of founding members in Sweden, the timing of the first international chapter, the geographic targeting of specific cities and regions for expansion, even the club's visual identity, those red and white colors. That specific patch configuration was chosen to signal precise alignment to people who understood the language while remaining technically and legally distinct from the parent organization in a way that courts and prosecutors would struggle to collapse. Designed, built, deployed. Not a motorcycle club that became powerful, a power structure that wore the identity of a motorcycle club and used that identity to move, grow, and operate in plain sight. The war's territory, blood, and consequences. The Red Devils' rise did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside a biker world that was already at war with itself on multiple continents simultaneously. In Australia, the conflict was visible, sustained, and sufficiently violent that it forced Australian state governments to introduce anti-association legislation specifically targeting motorcycle club members. The Red Devils, operating as frontline allies of the Hells Angels, spent years in active territorial rivalry with the Bandidos Motorcycle Club and the Rebels Motorcycle Club, two organizations with their own deep histories, their own territorial claims, and their own willingness to use extreme violence to defend what they considered theirs. These were not disputes about reputation or symbolic territory. They were disputes about control, physical control over geographic areas, control over narcotics, distribution networks running through Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, and Adelaide, and control over the financial flows that those networks generated. The violence surrounding those disputes was real, documented in police records across multiple states, and impossible for Australian authorities to ignore. In Scandinavia and across Northern Europe, the Red Devils found themselves embedded in a conflict that had already defined the biker world for years before their founding. The Great Nordic Biker War between the Hells Angels and the Bandidos, a conflict that ran through the mid to late 1990s and left at least 11 people dead across Denmark, Sweden, Norway, and Finland, had fundamentally reshaped the organizational landscape the Red Devils were built into. The Angels emerged from that conflict with significantly expanded territorial control across Scandinavia. The Red Devils were founded, in part, to help consolidate and protect what had been gained at such enormous cost. In the United States, federal investigators began building files on Red Devils chapters as early as the mid-2000s. The connection to the Hells Angels operational network meant that Red Devils activity in Massachusetts, and eventually in other American states where chapters began appearing, was being tracked not as a local biker club causing isolated trouble, but as a node inside a transnational criminal structure that federal prosecutors had been trying to dismantle for 30 years. The Red Devils gave those investigators a new angle, a visible, documentable connection between street-level activity and the parent organization that had always been so careful to maintain its distance. That distinction between a local club and a node in a transnational criminal structure would eventually become the foundation of the prosecutorial strategy that federal authorities deployed against these organizations. It just took years to build the evidentiary architecture to support it. The strategy had a name, and when it was finally deployed, it changed the legal landscape completely. Operation Broken Halo. A federal investigation that pulled back the curtain on the layered relationship between the Hells Angels and their support network in a way that prosecutors across the country had been trying to accomplish for the better part of a decade. The investigation focused on a series of violent incidents tied directly to the Hells Angels' territorial ambitions in the southeastern United States, including a confrontation in Lumberton, North Carolina, that federal investigators described in court documents as a planned, coordinated attack rather than a spontaneous conflict. The incident involved 8 Hells Angels members who confronted members of the rival Pagans Motorcycle Club outside a restaurant. Among those involved were Jason Lee Hathaway, Fred Joseph Prosperi, known as Freddie, and William Scott Gardner, known as Big Will. According to federal investigators, what appeared to begin as a confrontation escalated within seconds into a violent street battle. Bullets crossed the parking lot. Ball-peen hammers were used as close-range weapons. Families eating dinner at the restaurant were caught in the middle of an organized attack. Federal prosecutors argued the entire incident was the direct operational result of a standing order from Hells Angels leadership to remove pagan influence from a specific corridor of territory the Angels had designated as their own. All 8 defendants were charged with attempted murder and assault with a deadly weapon in aid of racketeering. The investigation also surfaced a figure named Jonathan Michael Robage, a man with documented ties to both the Hells Angels and the Red Devils, who was separately charged with witness tampering. Prosecutors alleged that Robage had carried out a sustained, systematic campaign of threats, physical intimidation, and harassment directed at a cooperating witness in the case. The actions, prosecutors argued in court filings, reflected the lengths these organizations are structurally willing to go to enforce the silence that protects their operations. This was not the impulsive response of one angry person. It was organized suppression of testimony, carried out with the resources and reach of a criminal enterprise. That last part was not a surprise to experienced investigators. It was a confirmation of something they had known for years. The code of silence that protects organizations like the Red Devils and the Hells Angels is not informal, not incidental, and not enforced by social pressure alone. It is structural. It is actively maintained. And the willingness to enforce it through violence against witnesses, against members who show signs of wavering, against anyone whose cooperation might create a thread investigators could pull, is not a side effect of the culture these organizations have built. It is the culture. The silence is the product, and they have been refining it for decades. The legal net tightens. For years, in some jurisdictions for more than a decade, the support club structure that made the Red Devils so operationally useful to the Hells Angels also made them extraordinarily difficult to prosecute in a way that reached the parent organization. Every time investigators built a case against a Red Devils chapter, the charges stopped at that chapter. The Angels sat above it, insulated and untouched, while their support structure absorbed the consequences. That changed. Federal prosecutors in the United States began adapting their approach to the layered organizational structure of outlaw biker networks by deploying a legal tool that had existed for decades under federal law but had rarely been applied to: motorcycle clubs at the scale and ambition required to reach the top of the hierarchy. The Vicar Statute, Violent Crimes in Aid of Racketeering, gave prosecutors the mechanism they needed. It allowed them to connect individual violent acts not just to the person who committed them, but to the criminal enterprise that directed and benefited from those acts. Instead of charging a single Red Devils member for a single incident of violence, prosecutors could now build a case that named the entire organizational enterprise, including the support club structure and its relationship to the parent organization, and charge every person connected to that enterprise. Within the same federal case, the implications for organizations like the Red Devils were profound. The structural buffers that had protected the Hells Angels from direct criminal exposure, the support clubs, the carefully maintained arm's-length relationships, the deliberate distance between the people giving orders and the people carrying them out, were no longer functioning as effective insulation. They were functioning as evidence. The same organizational architecture that had been designed to create legal distance was now being used by federal prosecutors to demonstrate coordination, deliberate control, and criminal intent at the organizational level. Every structure that had been built to protect the Angels was being read by investigators and prosecutors as proof that the Angels were running something that needed protecting. In practical terms, a Red Devils member carrying out a violent act in service of the Hells Angels' territorial interests was no longer just a Red Devils problem, it was a Hells Angels problem. And the angel above him, who had maintained the organizational structure that made the order possible, even if he never issued a word directly, was now potentially within reach of a federal indictment for the first time. The walls were moving, not toward the Red Devils, toward the people above them. Law enforcement agencies outside the United States began adopting comparable approaches, adapted to their own legal systems. In Australia, federal and state authorities coordinated to move away from a strategy of targeting individual chapters for individual incidents toward mapping the entire organizational network chapter by chapter, relationship by relationship, financial flow by financial flow, and building the kind of comprehensive evidence base that made prosecution of the structure, not just its individual members, legally viable. In Europe, cross-border cooperation between national law enforcement agencies, coordination that would have been logistically impossible even 10 years earlier, allowed investigators to track Red Devils' activity across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously, connecting incidents that would previously have appeared unrelated into a documented pattern of coordinated criminal enterprise. The Red Devils, for their part, adapted. They always had. Operational security tightened noticeably in the wake of major investigations. Encrypted communications became standard. Internal leadership structures became harder to identify from the outside. The club doubled down on everything that had always distinguished it from less disciplined organizations: discretion, compartmentalization, the discipline to say nothing under pressure and reveal nothing through behavior. But adapting and becoming genuinely invisible are two very different things. In the modern investigative environment, with digital surveillance tools that can track encrypted communications, financial forensics, capable of following money through layers of cryptocurrency and offshore accounts, and international law enforcement cooperation that would have seemed like science fiction in the 1990s, the Red Devils were no longer operating in the darkness they had once relied on as a fundamental operational advantage. The question was never really whether law enforcement could see them. The question was what seeing them would actually produce in court. And that question was getting harder to answer in the Red Devils' favor with each passing year. An unexpected chapter: China. Not every chapter of the Red Devils' story is written in blood, arrest warrants, and federal indictments. One of them is written in something considerably more unexpected: adaptation. The Shanghai chapter of the Red Devils Motorcycle Club exists inside one of the most politically controlled and legally restrictive environments on the planet. China's government does not tolerate organized criminal activity in any form that creates visible challenge to state authority, and the kind of operations that define Red Devils chapters in North America, Europe, and Australia narcotics trafficking networks, territorial enforcement, weapons logistics, the financial infrastructure of organized crime cannot function inside mainland China the way they function in Western democratic systems. The Chinese state has both the legal framework and the enforcement capacity to eliminate that kind of operation before it can establish the roots it needs to survive. So the Shanghai chapter did something that speaks directly to what the Red Devils actually are at their most fundamental level, beneath all the operational infrastructure and criminal associations. They separated the identity from the criminality. The patches remain, the chapter structure remains, the hierarchy remains president, vice president, sergeant-at-arms, the full organizational architecture that defines Red Devils chapters everywhere they operate. The loyalty system, the prospecting process, the clubhouse culture, the shared identity built around motorcycles, and the brotherhood of riding, all of it intact. What was removed, or more precisely, what simply cannot exist inside China's political environment, is the criminal operational infrastructure that law enforcement agencies in other countries associate with the 1% world. No documented narcotics operations, no weapons trafficking networks, no enforcement activity against rivals. What remains is something that criminologists genuinely struggle to categorize. A fully operational outlaw biker culture, complete in every visible respect, functioning within the legal constraints of an authoritarian state, brotherhood without the bleeding, identity without the indictment, the form without the function that the form usually serves. Some observers view the Shanghai chapter as evidence that the core of biker culture, the sense of belonging, the rigid loyalty structure, the identity built around shared experience and mutual commitment can exist independently of the criminal activity that so thoroughly defines it in Western contexts. Others see something more troubling in that same fact, evidence that the Red Devils' organizational model is sufficiently flexible and sufficiently durable that it can survive inside virtually any political environment, adapting its visible behavior to whatever constraints exist, while preserving the underlying structure that makes it valuable. A club that can operate inside China's political system without disappearing, without fracturing, and without losing its organizational coherence has mastered something that most criminal organizations never figure out: how to be everywhere at once without looking like anything the state needs to eliminate. The machine behind the machine. The Hells Angels call themselves the Big Red Machine. It is not an accident of branding, and it is not empty marketing. It is a description of what they have built and how they think about what they have built. A machine has parts. The parts have specific, defined functions. The machine operates at its best when each part performs its function reliably, predictably, and without drawing attention to the mechanism that drives the whole. From that perspective, the perspective of people who think about the Hells Angels not as a motorcycle club, but as a global criminal enterprise with a market capitalization measured in billions, the Red Devils are not simply a support club. They are a precision component inside a very large, very carefully engineered machine. And understanding what that means requires understanding how the Hells Angels actually operate at organizational scale. The Angels function structurally like an international franchise network, an analogy that law enforcement analysts and academic criminologists have used for years to describe the organizational model because it captures something essential about how power and accountability are distributed across the structure. Each chapter is a franchise location. It carries the parent brand, operates under the parent brand's rules and standards, and benefits from the global infrastructure and reputation the parent brand has built. But it is locally operated, locally managed, and locally accountable for its own revenue generation and operational decisions within the framework the parent brand provides. The parent organization supplies identity, protection, supply chain access, and the organizational legitimacy that comes with belonging to a globally recognized institution. The chapter supplies market presence, local operational capacity, and territorial control. Support clubs occupy the layer immediately below the franchise structure. They are not part of the franchise in the formal or legal sense. They carry their own name, wear their own patches, maintain their own formal organizational identity. But operationally, they function as extensions of the parent network. They execute work that serves Angel interests. They answer to Angels' leadership through channels that are enforced but carefully not documented. And in exchange, they receive the two things that matter most in the outlaw biker world: protection from above and a clearly defined place in a hierarchy that gives their membership meaning and their operations structural support. The Red Devils' position within that structure is unusually elevated for a support club. Most support clubs exist in relative obscurity, known only within their immediate regional context. The Red Devils are known to law enforcement agencies on 5 continents. Their chapters appear in intelligence databases from Stockholm to Sao Paulo to Sydney. Their relationship with the Angels is documented in federal court filings in the United States, in police intelligence reports in Australia, and in organized crime assessments produced by Europol and Interpol. They are, by any measure, one of the most visible and most operationally significant support clubs in the world. That visibility comes with a cost that is worth examining honestly. When the Angels need something accomplished that cannot be officially attributed to the Angels' territorial enforcement in a new market, disruption of a rival's supply chain, physical demonstration of force in a disputed area, the Red Devils are the answer. When a confrontation needs to happen, and the parent organization needs to maintain operational distance, the Red Devils absorb the direct risk. When a message needs to be sent to a rival organization without creating a documented chain of accountability that leads back to Angels' leadership, Red Devils members deliver it. They take the exposure. The machine keeps running. For many Red Devils members, that arrangement is not experienced as exploitation or as a raw deal. It is experienced as honor, being trusted with the most important and most dangerous work, being close enough to the real center of organizational power that your actions genuinely shape outcomes, operating with the knowledge that the largest outlaw motorcycle organization in the world has confidence in your reliability inside this culture. That is not a burden. That is the entire point of being there. The risk is the honor. The danger is the proof of trust, which is precisely what makes the Red Devils so extraordinarily difficult for law enforcement to disrupt through conventional means. You cannot turn people against a structure they genuinely believe in. You cannot build informants inside an organization where the loyalty is real, not performed. You cannot dismantle a brotherhood with a warrant. The price of the patch. There is a version of this story that ends cleanly. The Red Devils keep growing, keep operating, keep embedding deeper into the global infrastructure of organized crime, and eventually become something that law enforcement can document thoroughly, but cannot meaningfully penetrate or dismantle. That version is not entirely wrong, but it leaves out the part that matters most to the people actually wearing the patch. The price of belonging to something this tightly bound, this hierarchically demanding, and this operationally dangerous falls on individual members in ways that are not always visible from the outside. Members of Red Devils chapters across multiple countries have been arrested, charged, convicted, and imprisoned, some for incidents directly tied to their chapter's documented activities, some swept up in broader RICO-style prosecutions that targeted everyone connected to the enterprise, and some for acts of violence that were ordered by people they will never publicly name, carried out in service of organizational interests that will never officially acknowledge their sacrifice. Families are affected. Children grow up with fathers in prison or fathers who are permanently under police surveillance. Partners live with the constant awareness that a knock on the door at 6 a.m. is always a possibility. The community around a Red Devils chapter exists in a permanent state of proximity to consequences that it did not choose and cannot control. And then there is the internal danger, the threat that does not come from law enforcement or from rival organizations, but from the structure itself. When Craig McElquam, a full patch Hells Angels member in Ontario, who had spent years operating within the same organizational ecosystem as the Red Devils, accumulating the kind of deep operational knowledge that comes from being genuinely close to the center of a criminal network, it was shot and killed in a Burlington restaurant parking lot on the 29th of April, 2025. The investigation that followed exposed something that investigators across the biker world have been quietly documenting for years. The people most likely to be killed inside these organizations are not always the targets of rival clubs from the outside. Sometimes they are the people on the inside who know too much, who have been present for too many things, whose continued existence In a world where loyalty is absolute and the consequences of betrayal are permanent, represents a calculated liability that the organization eventually decides exceeds their value. That calculation does not happen in every case. Most members live out their time in these organizations without facing that specific threat. But the fact that it happens at all, that an organization can make a decision, through whatever internal process it uses, that a long-serving member is more dangerous alive than dead, is the clearest possible articulation of what loyalty inside these structures actually means. At its most fundamental level, it means what the club decides it means, at any given moment, for any given member, and there is no appeals process. For Red Devils members who understand this, and the ones who have been around long enough always do, that reality operates in the permanent background of every decision they make. The patch that grants them status, protection, identity, and a place inside one of the most powerful criminal networks in the world is also, at the same time, a leash. And the leash can be pulled from any direction, at any time, by people whose names most Red Devils members across the world will never know. That is the architecture of power at this level, visible from the outside, invisible from the inside, until the moment it becomes impossible to ignore. What the rise actually means, and were they ever truly independent? By the mid-2020s, the Red Devils Motorcycle Club had chapters operating on every inhabited continent. Their documented operational footprint extended across North America, Europe, Australia, South America, and Asia. Their relationship with the Hells Angels remained intact, functional, productive, and strategically valuable to both organizations in ways that 2 decades of law enforcement pressure had not been able to fundamentally alter. Investigators in multiple countries maintained active files. Federal prosecutors in the United States had demonstrated that the Vicar statute could reach into the support club structure in ways that had seemed legally impossible a decade earlier. And the legal tools being refined in courtrooms from Raleigh to Rotterdam were beginning to produce results that reached higher into the organizational hierarchy than anything the previous generation of biker prosecutions had managed. The rise of the Red Devils, measured from that founding moment in Karlstad, Sweden, in 2001, took approximately 2 decades to reach the scale of a genuinely global organization. For an organization of this complexity, operating in this many legal jurisdictions against this level of sustained law enforcement opposition, that is not a slow rise, that is extraordinary. It is the kind of expansion that most criminal organizations, with all the resources of established drug cartels and traditional organized crime families at their disposal, fail to achieve in 2 decades. The Red Devils achieved it while operating as a support club nominally subordinate to another organization, without the full institutional weight of the Angels' name attached to everything they did. What explains it? Not luck, not organic popularity, not the kind of charismatic founding leadership that occasionally produces explosive organizational growth in criminal enterprises. The Red Devils expanded fast because they were designed to expand fast, resourced to do it by one of the wealthiest and most established criminal enterprises in the world, and positioned inside a global hierarchy that gave them both the incentive structure and the operational infrastructure to move into new markets before rivals could identify the threat and respond. They rose because the machine they served needed them to rise, and they were built from the selection of their first members in Sweden, to the choice of their founding location, to the colors on their backs, to the pace of their international expansion to do exactly that and nothing else. Which brings the question that has been sitting at the center of this entire story to its inevitable surface. Were the Red Devils ever truly independent? The honest answer is no, and the evidence that supports that answer has been accumulating since 2001. The Red Devils were never independent in the way that word actually means when applied to an organization. They were never independent in the sense of making their own strategic decisions about where to expand, what markets to enter, what operations to run, or what their relationship to the Hells Angels would look like. From the moment of their founding in Sweden, the Red Devils existed in an explicit, structural, operational relationship to the Hells Angels that defined everything about how the club functioned. Their expansion was resourced by that relationship. Their operational role, the shock troop function, the vetting pipeline, the legal buffer between the parent organization and the most dangerous work, was defined by that relationship. Their identity itself, Those red and white colors that granted them status in the biker hierarchy was granted by that relationship and could be revoked by it. An organization that cannot change its colors without permission from another organization cannot expand into new territory without that organization's approval, and cannot exist in a given region without the ongoing consent of the organization it serves, is not independent. It is a division. A carefully branded, operationally sophisticated, globally distributed division of a larger enterprise, but a division nonetheless. That conclusion does not erase or diminish what the Red Devils built at the human level. It does not invalidate the discipline, the genuine loyalty, the real brotherhood that members across their chapters have described and demonstrated over decades. People who have worn that patch, in some cases for the majority of their adult lives, experience something real. The identity is real. The relationships are real. The commitment is real. The bonds forged inside those chapters have survived imprisonment, violence, police pressure, and time in ways that most ordinary civilian relationships cannot. But the strategic framework that made all of it possible, that decided where the Red Devils would exist, what they would do, and whose interests their existence would ultimately serve, was never theirs to control. It belonged to the machine above them. It always had. And in every major decision that shaped the organization's trajectory, from founding location to international expansion to operational role to the colors they were permitted to wear, that machine's priorities, not the Red Devils' own, were the ones that drove the outcome. That gap between the genuine Brotherhood members experience every day and the strategic purpose that Brotherhood was always serving for someone else is where the real story of the Red Devils lives. Not in the patches or the parking lot confrontations or the federal indictments or the encrypted communications that investigators are still trying to crack. In that gap, in the space between what the members believe they built and what the people above them actually built them to be. The Red Devils rose, faster than almost anyone outside law enforcement predicted, farther than any support club had managed in the modern era of organized crime enforcement. With more discipline, more geographic ambition, and more lasting organizational impact than clubs that had been building for decades before the first Swedish chapter ever held its first meeting. But they rose in the direction the machine pointed them, and somewhere above the chapters, above the patches, above the men who absorbed the arrests and the violence and the consequences, the machine that built them is still running, adapting, refining, finding new ways to stay ahead of the investigators who have spent 2 decades learning how to read it. The Red Devils are not the end of this story, they are a chapter of it, and the next chapter is already being written by people whose names most of us will never know, in cities that have not yet made the news, inside an organization that has proven, over and over, that it is very good at writing chapters that no one sees coming. If this story held your attention from the first sentence to the last, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We cover the stories most people don't tell, and we're not done. Thank you for watching.